LBR LBO Infrastructure Summit 2016.
How are you guys doing? Good? Come on. How are you guys doing? Yeah, good. Throughout the session, we've lacked a little bit of energy from the audience, so hopefully we'll get things going here. Very interesting topic, 40 billion in 10 years. We'll debate the validity of that and if that's even the right number. So without taking too much time, I invite Anupam to give us a presentation on brand building.
Thank you. Hi, I'm sorry that you've had to miss your coffee break. I'll try and make this as interesting as possible, as I'm sure the rest of my colleagues on the panel will. The presentation's called Driven by a Pride for obvious reasons. I think nations are often about drivers of pride, and pride is a great catalyst for building nation brands or city brands, what have you. I'm going to break up my presentation today in a few different parts. The first is a very quick introduction to the partners, which is a world-leading brand design innovation agency which I work with and is part of the WPP group. Very quickly, I'm actually going to spend some time in setting up what I believe is a nation branding framework. This is something that really wasn't, hasn't come out from a textbook, but something that we put together when I was part of Branding India about a decade ago, and had the fortune of being part of what is perhaps the most successful nation branding campaign ever, and I'll share with you why exactly that is the case. The third part is really about Brand Sri Lanka. This has really been put together in about 48 hours, partly because this is my first visit to Colombo and to Sri Lanka. And I hate putting suggestions or ideas together for brands that I'm not familiar with. So I've tried as much as possible to get a crash course in Sri Lanka over the last 48 hours. There's only so much you can learn from the internet. So I've tried very hard to have some really interesting conversations. Lakshman was kind enough to put me in touch with some really interesting people at yesterday's reception. So I'm going to talk briefly about some ideas and a framework for Brand Sri Lanka. And finally, I'm sure I don't need to tell you what 1996 represents for this country, so we'll come to that. Very quickly, and I'm just going to skim through this, we are the world's most awarded brand agency, which is not necessarily the measure of success, but it's a good indicator to kind of tell yourself that you're on the right track. It's really the work that we do for our clients that really talks for itself. We've had the privilege of working with many private sector organizations, but also some of the world's leading cultural institutions, and some of them are up here. And I think when we're talking about nation branding, I think it's often good to look at nations are concepts and really representations of cultures. Very quick look into one of our global clients, Deloitte, which we began work with about 8 years ago, and we reinvented this brand and came up with the idea of the green dot, and it's really endured, and it's now, we're very proud that it's one of the world's leading professional services firms. Another one closer home is AirAsia. We began our Asia practice only about 5 years ago. This was our foundational client, and we worked with Tony Fernandez, who's a really ambitious entrepreneur, and what began as a conversation to brand the tail fin of my aircraft became a brand transformation program for this fantastic airline. This was the before. As you can see, it's a sea of red. This is the after. I won't spend time on this, but the idea here was inspired by Asia, and I think we gave the brand a tremendous lease of life, and it's still going strong. So very, very proud of that work as well. But coming to the subject at hand today, how loud is your echo? I think that kind of phrase is self-explanatory. It's about doing something loudly, hopefully clearly, and letting the echo last. And in marketing terms, I think it's an interesting phrase, and I'll come to that. But if you look at the global marketplace, I think it's already cluttered with all sorts of brands. And I think whether it's London or South Africa or Malaysia, there's a lot of stuff out there. It's about tourism, it's about investment, everybody's doing it. This slide is actually about 10 years old, so there's a lot more countries and cities in there now. But I think what differentiates really from the ones that are successful from the ones that are not is perception. Regrettably, this isn't about product. And I know a lot of my colleagues on the panel, and rightly so, will talk about product and ease of doing business. But I think we need to separate the two. Country brands or city brands, for that matter, often operate at two levels, always operate at two levels. There will be the day-to-day, the year-to-year, in a democratic framework, election cycle to election cycle. There will be that. That's reality, that's life. But the brand doesn't need to, should not, if it's managed successfully, should not operate in tandem with the product. It should be ahead of the product. It should be selling a vision. And that really is what perception is all about. Regrettably, if you don't do this, you're going to be limited to name recognition alone. And that name could mean anything. You let others actually frame the positioning for you, and you let the stereotypes determine your brand's positioning. And this is very true for nations. This is a very simple setup that will tell you that on one axis there's the medium, and on the other is message. And I think as there are more and more messages, as there will tend to be, despite what you will be told by many so-called nation branding experts, there will be no cohesive platform that can send out one message. There will always be several, and as it should be. You can't really control message in a democratic nation context. So there will be many messages, but if there is some sort of alignment, then you can probably try and traverse this trajectory, which is obviously not as linear as I've made it out to be, but increased investment and economic activity. But there are three very important phases that a brand must go through, and I don't think there's any way to avoid this. The first one is about information. You need to provide solid information to people who take investment decisions or influence investment decisions. Hopefully, if you do it right, it's going to be helpful in shaping opinion. And finally, you can actually expect that there is positive experience. This is a very confusing slide, so I won't spend too much time on it. This was done by a management consulting firm that we worked with about 10 years ago. But what it basically shows you on the left is a strong brand eventually leads to economic growth and quality of life, but also influence in geopolitics. And I think that's a very important objective. Often, nation branding campaigns are about tourism. I think they need to be about public diplomacy, but perhaps held together by an economic brand strategy. At the end of the day, brand building for nations, often for products as well, is about being different and choosing things that actively make you different and stand out from the others. This is the model that I used for branding India. If you look at the bottom of the pyramid, it's really about the positioning. The center part is about the activation and managing the campaigns and the activity, and hopefully you create brand ambassadors and networks of investors or people who believe in your brand. This was the positioning that we came up with. It was a really interesting story. I won't get into it right now, but you can have a look at my LinkedIn profile and see the story there. The fastest growing free market democracy was basically an idea framed competitively vis-a-vis China. That, India was not going to be able to compete with China at the time. And we came up with this. This is actually a billboard at Zurich Airport. We ran a campaign called India Everywhere at Davos. It took about 18 months in planning. And it was perhaps, as I said, the most interesting nation branding campaign ever. In terms of data, you can actually see this is FDI figures, not including remittances, but equity from companies that flew into the country. And it's very interesting, the pattern. These were the 3 years there that we, as India Brand Equity Foundation, which was a joint venture between the government and the private sector, was, I think, in sole measure responsible for this success. And it was tremendous. I won't get into the detail, I don't have the time. But coming very quickly to Sri Lanka. I apologize for the font size that's going to follow, but I'm going to talk you through some of this so that you can make out. This is a very simple framework. On one axis, there's time. On the other axis, there's differentiation. And I think the key point here is that you need to keep being different. But at the end of the day, it needs to be rooted in some sort of an insight, some sort of an idea. What it says here is brand Sri Lanka wants to delink its positioning from a South Asian nation to an Indian Ocean region positioning. This is what I heard yesterday. The megapolis project, while compelling and visionary, requires enormous amounts of capital, talent, and conviction. It also needs a balance between strategy and execution, and to build a strong foundation and template for cities and sustainable growth across the nation. This is today. What's the insight? I've only spent 24 hours here, but I think based on experience and understanding of the region generally, post the financial crisis, there is renewed belief in Asia, and specifically in India, as an investment destination. Could Sri Lanka be a bolt-on investment destination strategically and tactically? What's the idea then? Could we think about positioning Sri Lanka as an alternative to Singapore and Mauritius for foreign investors, and more specifically, investors targeting India? There's only 1 minute left, so I'll have to really speed past this. Essentially, what this talks about is doing a series of things that makes Sri Lanka more than what it is. And I guess we might pick it up in the discussion. But essentially, I think the ambition needs to be different. And it doesn't have to be linked in size. You can always punch above your weight. Brings me to the last part of the presentation, 1996, when the team from Sri Lanka won that famous World Cup. And I think it was about entrepreneurship, which in my mind is the pursuit of opportunity beyond the resources that you currently control. Here are 10 things that I thought as tactics. We're in the World Cup. Imagine that it's begun. You have to build this megapolis, whether you get 40 billion or 400 or 4, I think the point is almost irrelevant. You still need to have some strategies and tactics. Think horizontally. What I mean by that is don't think about trade numbers, investment numbers, tourism numbers. Think of what's the glue that brings it all together. And in my mind, megapolis is a great idea because cities operate horizontally. It's about all of those things. Business-led, I think very important, entrepreneurial leaders, government coordinated, but community owned. At the end of the day, if a nation brand has to be owned by its citizens. Have a 30-year vision, but have a 3-year implementation horizon. Reconcile, renew, and relaunch. There is no such thing as a perfect strategy. Human capital is key. Get the best talent, whether from Sri Lanka or foreign. It doesn't matter. There's a lot of talent out there. Some of the best teams in the world in any sport often have no domestic talent. This is not about ego. Finance is fine, but make sure there's fun. And that operates at multiple levels. Master developer approach. I think there is a master developer for Megapolis, but I think the idea is very, very good. There should be perhaps 2 or 3 key master developers in any large-scale project, not fragmented too much. Build buildings, yes, but build brands. Brands sit in people's heads. They have enormous equity. I won't go into whether they can be measured or not. Yes, they can, but that's a topic for another discussion. Heritage is a key driver. If I look at Singapore, where I live now and call home, I think it's a great example of how it's transformed in 30 years. But what many people don't know about is where they see the gleaming success of the infrastructure, is how heritage has been carefully nurtured and is, in fact, perhaps in the next phase of transformation, going to be a key driver for Singapore's continued success. And last but not the least, mega events can be catalysts. And yes, you'll say Commonwealth Games, Commonwealth Summit. I think this is not a prescription of bring the Olympics or bring the Commonwealth Games. So I'm going to leave you with a thought and an idea of an event called the Volvo Ocean Race, which I think is a perfect fit for Sri Lanka. It's the world's longest yacht race. And the stopover brings enormous kinds of benefits, both economic and social and cultural, and puts you on the map. Alicante, a port city in Spain, has used this extremely strategically and successfully. Again, I could go on and on about this, but I will end now. Thank you so much. Hope you found that useful.
LBR LBO Infrastructure Summit 2016.